forcing his conclusions upon us as if we had been so many wax cylinders of a phonograph that would repeat accurately what had been told us, and these questions I have mentioned he used to emphasize any special point that he seemed to think required such emphasis. The fact was, however, the picture of what had actually happened was so vivid still in his own mind that it reached ours by a process of telepathy which he could not control or prevent. All through his true-false words this picture stood forth in fearful detail against the shadows behind him. He could not veil, much less obliterate it. We knew, and I always thought he knew that we knew. The story itself, as I have said, was sufficiently ordinary. Jake and himself, in a 9-foot canoe, had upset in the middle of a lake, and had held hands across the upturned craft for several hours, eventually cutting holes in her ribs to stick their arms through and grasp hands, lest the numbness of the cold water should overcome them. They were miles from shore, and the wind was drifting them down upon a little island. But when they got within a few hundred yards of the island, they realized, to their horror, that they would, after all, drift past it. It was then the quarrel began. Jake was leaving the canoe and swimming. Rushton believed in waiting till they actually had passed the island and were sheltered from the wind. Then they could make the island easily by swimming, canoe and all. But Jake refused to give in, and after a short struggle, Rushton admitted there was a struggle, got free from the canoe, and disappeared without a single cry. Rushton held on and proved the correctness of his theory, and finally made the island, canoe and all, after being in the water over 5 hours. He described to us how he crawled up onto the shore and fainted at once, with his feet lying half in the water, how lost and terrified he felt upon regaining consciousness in the dark, how the canoe had drifted away, and his extraordinary luck in finding it caught again at the end of the island by a projecting cedar branch. He told us that the little axe, another bit of real luck, had caught in the thwart when the canoe turned over, and how the little bottle in his pocket holding the emergency matches was whole and dry. He made a blazing fire and searched the island from end to end, calling upon Jake in the darkness, but getting no answer, till, finally, so many half-drowned men seemed to come crawling out of the water onto the rocks and vanish among the shadows when he came up with them, that he lost his nerve completely, and returned to lie down by the fire till the daylight came. He then cut a bough to replace the lost paddles, and after one more useless search for his lost companion, he got into the canoe, fearing every moment he would upset again, and crossed over to the mainland. He knew roughly the position of our camping place, and after paddling day and night, and making many weary portages, without food or covering, he reached us 2 days later. This, more or less, was the story, and we, knowing whereof he spoke, knew that every word was literally true, and at the same time went to the building up of a hideous and prodigious lie. Once the recital was over, he collapsed, and Silver Fizz, after a general expression of sympathy from the rest of us, came again to the rescue. "But now, mister, you just got to eat and drink, whether you've a mind to or no." And Matt Morris, cook that night, soon had the fried trout and bacon, and the wheat cakes and hot coffee passing round a rather silent and oppressed circle. So we ate round the fire, ravenously, as we had eaten every night for the past 6 weeks, but with this difference, that there was one among us who was more than ravenous, and he gorged. In spite of all our devices, he somehow kept himself the center of observation. When his tin mug was empty, Morris instantly passed the tea-pail. When he began to mop up the bacon grease with the dough on his fork, Hank reached out for the frying pan, and the can of steaming boiled potatoes was always by his side. And there was another difference as well. He was sick, terribly sick, before the meal was over, and this sudden nausea after food was more eloquent than words of what the man had passed through on his dreadful, foodless, ghost-haunted journey of 40 miles to our camp. In the darkness, he thought he would go crazy, he said. There were voices in the trees, and figures were always lifting themselves out of the water or from behind boulders to look at him and make awful signs. Jake constantly peered at him through the underbrush, and everywhere the shadows were moving, with eyes, footsteps, and following shapes. We tried hard to talk of other things, but it was no use, for he was bursting with the rehearsal of his story, and refused to allow himself the chances we were so willing and anxious to grant him. After a good night's rest he might have had more self-control and better judgment, and would probably have acted differently, but, as it was, we found it impossible to help him. Once the pipes were lit and the dishes cleared away, it was useless to pretend any longer. The sparks from the burning logs zigzagged upwards into a sky brilliant with stars. It was all wonderfully still and peaceful, and the forest odors floated to us on the sharp autumn air. The cedar fire smelt sweet, and we could just hear the gentle wash of tiny waves along the shore. All was calm, beautiful, and remote from the world of men and passion. It was, indeed, a night to touch the soul, and yet, I think, none of us heeded these things. A bull moose might almost have thrust his great head over our shoulders and have escaped unnoticed. The death of Jake the Swede, with its sinister setting, was the real presence that held the center of the stage and compelled attention. "You won't perhaps care to come along, mister," said Morris by way of a beginning. "But I guess I'll go with one of the boys here and have a hunt for it." "Sure," said Hank. "Jake and I done some biggest trips together in the old days, and I'll do that much for him." "It's deep water, they tell me, round them islands," added Silver Fizz. "But we'll find it, sure pop, if it's thar." They all spoke of the body as it. There was a minute or two of heavy silence, and then Rushton again burst out with his story in almost the identical words he had used before. It was almost as if he had learned it by heart. He wholly failed to appreciate the efforts of the others to let him off. Silver Fizz rushed in, hoping to stop him, Morris and Hank closely following his lead. "I once knew another traveling partner of his," he began quickly. "Used to live down Moose Jaw Rapids way." "Is that so?" said Hank. "Kinda useful sort of feller," chimed in Morris. All the idea the men had was to stop the tongue wagging before the discrepancies became so glaring that we should be forced to take notice of them and ask questions. But just as well try to stop an angry bull moose on the run, or prevent Beaver Creek freezing in midwinter by throwing in pebbles near the shore. Out it came, and though the discrepancy this time was insignificant, it somehow brought us all in a second face to face with the inevitable and dreaded climax. "And so I tramped all over that little bit of an island, hoping he might somehow have gotten in without my knowing it, and always thinking I heard that awful last cry of his in the darkness, and then the night dropped down impenetrably, like a damp thick blanket out of the sky, and—" All eyes fell away from his face. Hank poked up the logs with his boot, and Morris seized an ember in his bare fingers to light his pipe, although it was already emitting clouds of smoke. But the professor caught the ball flying. "I thought you said he sank without a cry," he remarked quietly, looking straight up into the frightened face opposite, and then riddling mercilessly the confused explanation that followed. The cumulative effect of all these forces, hitherto so rigorously repressed, now made itself felt, and the circle spontaneously broke up, everybody moving at once by a common instinct. The professor's wife left the party abruptly, with excuses about an early start next morning. She first shook hands with Rushton, mumbling something about his comfort in the night. The question of his comfort, however, devolved by force of circumstances upon myself, and he shared my tent. Just before wrapping up in my double blankets, for the night was bitterly cold, he turned and began to explain that he had a habit of talking in his sleep, and hoped I would wake him if he disturbed me by doing so. Well, he did talk in his sleep, and it disturbed me very much indeed. The anger and violence of his words remain with me to this day, and it was clear in a minute that he was living over again some portion of the scene upon the lake. I listened, horror-struck for a moment or two, and then understood that I was face to face with one of two alternatives. I must continue an unwilling eavesdropper, or I must waken him. The former was impossible for me, yet I shrank from the latter with the greatest repugnance, and in my dilemma I saw the only way out of the difficulty, and at once accepted it. Cold though I was, I crawled stealthily out of my warm sleeping bag and left the tent, intending to keep the old fire alight under the stars, and spend the remaining hours till daylight in the open. As soon as I was out, I noticed at once another figure moving silently along the shore. It was Hank Milligan, and it was plain enough that what he was doing. He was examining the holes that had been cut in the upper ribs of the canoe. He looked half ashamed when I came up to him, and mumbled something about not being able to sleep for the cold. But there, standing together beside the overturned canoe, we both saw that the holes were far too small for a man's hand and arm, and could not possibly have been cut by two men hanging on for their lives in deep water. Those holes had been made afterwards. Hank said nothing to me, and I said nothing to Hank, and presently he moved off to collect logs for the fire, which needed replenishing, for it was a piercingly cold night, and there were many degrees of frost. 3 days later, Hank and Silver Fizz followed with stumbling footsteps the old Indian trail that leads from Beaver Creek to the southwards. A hammock was slung between them, and it was weighed heavily. Yet neither of the men complained, and, indeed, speech between them was almost nothing. Their thoughts, however, were exceedingly busy, and the terrible secret of the woods which formed their burden weighed far more heavily than the uncouth, shifting mass that lay in the swinging hammock and tugged so severely at their shoulders. They had found it in 4 feet of water, not more than a couple of yards from the lee shore of the island, and in the back of the head was a long, terrible wound, which no man could possibly have inflicted upon himself. End of Skeleton Lake, an episode in camp.